Hi, I'm Ashley.
And I'm Chris, and this is Business by the Books.
Hi, welcome to the Business by the Books podcast, where we believe that leaders are readers. So if you are not reading, you are not leading. We are covering your absolute favorite book.
This will be it.
Yeah, this is it.
Probably
Cool.
out of 50, this is number one.
Yes. So, man, you tuned in for a great episode. So this is episode 10. We made it to 10.
Yeah.
So I guess this is
That's
a celebration
good. That's
of
a big
surviving.
deal.
Yes. So the book we're talking about today is The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, a Leadership Fable. And it was written by Patrick Lencioni and published in 2002. And when did you read this book?
Let's look.
He always has a
I always had
note in the front.
I completed it July 4, 2009.
Ooh,
So,
so
wow.
over 10
Almost-
years ago.
yeah.
That's crazy. A lot has changed in 10 years, so.
Yeah. For all of us.
Yes, for all of us. Yeah.
You were a little kid 10 years ago.
Yeah. Oops. Sorry to grow up. Cool. All right. Well, it is a fable. So what is kind of the concept and the essence behind the fable?
So here's my plug for this book. I think everyone should read this book.
Mm-hmm.
I think if there's required reading in the business community. Now, if you don't like to read, just do Audible, okay?
Okay.
But Patrick Lencioni, I've got all his books, and your uncle actually bought me his first book. Gosh, it's probably 25 years ago.
Which one was that one?
It was the 5 Temptations of a CEO. I think that was
Oh.
it. Gosh, I hadn't even thought about that book. So anyway, but I've got all his books stacked up on my shelf. So
That's
what
funny.
he does is he writes a fable, but he's a business consultant, but he integrates these different concepts into it. So that one was like CEO. And so all of them, they're very practical, but they're entertaining. I mean, you could get on an airplane here in Houston. By the time you get to Denver, 2.5 hours from here, you'd have read the book. And so you got the concept. So the reason I think it's such a good book is that most organizations, and when I say organizations, I mean churches, families, businesses, nonprofits, there's always some level of dysfunction. And so what he does is he unpacks, I mean, it's perfectly titled too, is what are the 5 dysfunctions of a team. So what we're going to talk about in this podcast is what are those dysfunctions. And the problem is, because organizations are dysfunctional, that they never become what they could become if they were functional. And so we read this book when I was leading a team, and we read it, and it was actually part of a retreat. So we had an annual retreat every October, and this was the book that we chose to read, or I chose for us to read as a group that year. And it really opened up. And one of the things that we did was, we kind of had an open session, and we went around the room, and we talked about things that some people in the group did that bothered us. And so it was really, if I go back and I think about that team, it really was an important part of us gelling together. And we knew when we had things come up, we could go back to this book because it was so practical and address those things kind of head on.
We like practical.
We do.
Yeah. Sweet. Awesome. So kind of what is the plot? What is the storyline of this book specifically?
So there's basically a CEO. She comes in, and she's an older lady. She's probably my age in the story, but I kind of envision she's probably in her 50s or maybe in her early 60s. And so she comes from a kind of a stodgy industry. She's maybe like part of the automotive industry, and she's coming in and she's working with these high-tech, hip, young company, up-and-coming kind of startup company in the San Francisco Bay Area, and that's where Patrick lives. And so she comes in, and there's this group of people that she kind of has to work with, and she basically helps them unpack the dysfunctionality in the group. And what's really interesting, Ashley, is it's such a well-written book, you almost feel like you're part of the story. And so there's people that want to sabotage what they're trying to do, and they actually get together in a retreat, kind of an offsite. So that also influenced me. I like when any group that I'm leading, I like to do offsite retreats at least once a year, preferably twice a year, just to get away from the office and just get to know a little bit, get to know each other a little bit better. But she basically leads this group of people who are younger than her in how to manage these dysfunctions. And then, of course, like every good story, on the end of it everybody's happy, and the people that aren't have left the organization.
So is it her kind of talking and training these younger folks about the 5 dysfunctions?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
So she's kind of helping them understand why this doesn't work or this doesn't work because of the 5 dysfunctions. So what I'd like to do, if you're okay with it, is just read the 5 dysfunctions, and then we can just, for the next 15 or 20 minutes kind of unpack what those are.
Let's do it.
So the 5 dysfunctions are, the first one is absence of trust, fear of conflict, lack of commitment, avoidance of accountability, and the number 5 is inattention to results. So my observation in most organizations which tend to be dysfunctional, as I said, every organization has some dysfunction. The top 2, one is absence of trust, fear of conflict, are the number 1 and 2 reasons that organizations don't work. So I think, Patrick has done a lot of research, and he's been a consultant for a long time. So let's talk a little bit about absence of trust. So what happens is when you have an organization where people don't trust each other, they hold their cards close to their vest. Yeah. And especially for leaders, if people don't trust a leader, they're not going to tell them that there's things that are wrong. So I'll tell you a little story. Your grandfather told me he worked at Bell Helicopter when I was little, and your uncle was born. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so he worked with technicians in the lab. And so, they're building helicopters. So he's an engineer, and he's working with the technicians in the lab. And he said that engineers can tend to be confrontational, and they think they know everything. And so he said, I would go out in the lab and I'd work with these technicians. And he said, I was always really humble, and I'd ask them what their thoughts were, and I engaged them in the process. And so as a result of that, he developed a trust with them. And so if they said, well, hey, Richard, you might want to think about this because we tried this, 6 months ago and it didn't work. He said, versus the engineers that went out there and said, hey, this is what we're going to do and don't argue with me, that the technicians wouldn't say anything to them, and they'd bolt something up and things would go flying apart. So in that situation, because the technicians didn't trust the engineer, that they wouldn't tell them things that would prevent parts from flying apart. I'm sure everything was done safely, but you need trust when any relationship in order for people to feel that they can share their thoughts. And so anyway, I think that's a number 1 reason, in marriages and friendships and relationships, if people trust each other, it's just amazing what you can do.
Yeah. And that's, in my own relationship with my fiance, as well as some of my really close friends, it's 100% built on this idea that I am able to talk to them about certain issues that I wouldn't talk to just anybody with.
Right.
And then something that was interesting, I like this idea of specifically concentrating on the absence of trust, because when I worked at Disney, there was one particular leader, not a leader, somebody below the leader position who was not trustworthy, who did not exhibit just a lot of integrity and maturity. And because of that, it made so many of us uncomfortable. And it made the job not as fun. It made it so much stressful. And so, but versus some of the leaders and some of the people that I really trusted, it made the job so much more fun. And it made me feel confident in what I was doing. It made me feel like if there was a problem, I could speak to them very freely and very openly, and I knew that it would get taken care of, and that it just made me feel part of a team.
And it's funny, all it takes in a group, what's the old saying, all it takes is one bad apple, it takes one person to basically disrupt that trust barrier. They create a barrier that prevents the trust from being displaced to everybody else.
Exactly. And this one person really, really made it difficult for me specifically to really just function whenever this person was working, and it was weird.
Well, and as a leader, you got to get rid of those people.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Is you got to figure that out, and you either confront them and say, "Look, you need to work on these things."
Yeah.
And you give them as much time as you feel appropriate. But at some point, if they're causing havoc and they're preventing the rest of the group from being successful, you got to get rid of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, but other than that, Disney was just such a fun experience. It's super. I loved everybody.
Well, even at Disney, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And that's exactly. And that's the thing is in any organization. And I like how you talked about earlier that this book applies not only to businesses but it also applies to nonprofits, to churches, to families. Right. And because I've seen and I know people who have and are a part of families where there isn't a trust and there isn't a safe space where they can talk about things that they're really struggling with. Right. And it just breeds this environment of contempt and just it's not a fun place to be.
Well, and the fun thing when you read this as a group, and everybody's aware of these things, then when you're in different situations, you can kind of recall, like, hey, we talked about this in the book.
You can pinpoint it.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's awesome. Sweet. Second one.
Okay, fear of conflict. So, man, conflict's tough, right?
It's not
because
fun.
because there's a certain set of people. I mean, I've had 100 people. There's probably like 3 to 5 who really like conflict,
Yeah.
right? And then there's probably 15 or 20 that can't stand it, and everybody else is in the middle. You know, you do it as necessary, but you have to have some conflict in every organization, right? I mean, it's just, there always has to be what I call a healthy tension. So if you have a situation, and once again, it starts with trust, right? So if people are a consequence of trust is vulnerability. And we don't talk about that a lot in the business world. Now, we talk about in terms of relationships like marriages and family. We talk about church all the time. But in a business community, you know, we don't often say, hey, I love you, or you're willing to be vulnerable, but it's a tremendously powerful asset. So if people trust each other and they're willing to be vulnerable, then you can have healthy conflict. And what that means is a healthy conflict means I don't agree with you, okay, but I'm going to listen to what you have to say, and we're going to find a compromise. And you know, I think we talked about in the last podcast, you know, about what is something that I really learned from the book about the penguins and the iceberg melting is to not get defensive as a leader. And so that allows people to come in and visit with you and say, hey, this is what I think we need to be doing, and you're open. And so what that does is it empowers them. It's like, hey, I can kind of speak my mind here without having a consequence for that.
Admittedly, in my relationship with my fiance, we've gone through marriage counseling and all this stuff in preparation for getting married in less than 2 months. But through that, it's been really cool because whenever we do have conflict, I used to be very much in a state of fearing conflict, and I don't enjoy it. But specifically when I have conflict with Matt, I almost get excited about it because it inevitably leads to growth in our relationship. And so this concept of, and I've seen it even as now a leader in my organization at A&M, there's already been some conflict that we're having to deal with in differing personalities and differing ideas and perspectives. And so by working through that, it's been really cool because it's developed us as leaders as well as an organization. And it's gotten me excited, not necessarily for the conflict part, but for the growth that can result from that. So it's
like
exciting.
Patton said, if we're all thinking alike, we're not thinking, right? And so a lot of times the conflict results from having differing opinions, but that's a healthy thing, right? And that's what I'm saying, that every organization needs to have some kind of conflict, because if you don't, then people who disagree with you, they're not going to tell you that, and then the airplane's going to crash or something like that. And they've actually done a lot of studies. Organizations that don't have any conflict, I think Black Box Thinking talked about this, that people don't go to their superiors and say something's wrong. And this happened, I think, with the Korean Airlines, and the young pilots wouldn't tell the older pilots that something was wrong, and they would wind up crashing airplanes. So they had to have a cultural change in the airlines in order to allow the younger pilots to say, look, something's not right here. And the end result was lives were saved. You know, we're not just talking about, you know, it's one thing to make more money in business, but it's a whole nother when people's lives are at stake.
Yeah, absolutely. Ooh, man. All right, number 3.
Lack of commitment. So once again, you got the trust, you got the willingness to have conflict, healthy conflict, and then the third thing that result is lack of commitment. So, you know, a leader kind of has a mission statement. They said, this is where we're going to go as an organization. In order for you to do that, people have to be committed to it. So, you know, our main character, our CEO in this story, she had people on the team who weren't committed, and she had to figure out why weren't they committed. And at the end of the day, the ideal scenario is for someone to leave your organization because they just don't fit the culture. You, as a leader, you don't want to have to fire people. You know, it's an unhealthy thing in an organization, but a healthy culture, you know, people, and it doesn't mean there's necessarily anything wrong with them, they just may not fit within your culture. Yeah. And so I think commitment is huge. People who are committed to ideas, you can do great things. And you think about wars, you know, people who are committed. I mean, you know, obviously we love history in the Alexander House. And you think about, you know, George Washington and the War for Independence, and people were committed to this idea of American ideals of freedom and those kind of things that in some regards I think we could take a revisit at that, in our country right now as people, a commitment to what makes America America and its diversity and its having your own ideas and those kind of things, but a commitment to the American ideal that we care about each other.
Yeah.
And so in any organization, the leader is the one who sets the tone, and he or she are committed, and then the goal is to get other people to be committed to that as well.
Yeah. What it looks like in the midst of all of these 5 dysfunctions, it sounds and looks like that lack of commitment is it seems like it would be the easiest to spot, but perhaps one of the hardest to solve. Right. So I think it would be really easy to tell if somebody's not on board. If you can't fake it indefinitely. If you don't care about something, you just can't. As much as you want to try, nobody's that good of an actor. But just this idea of when you mentioned that the CEO had to figure out why they weren't committed, I feel like that's a much deeper rooted issue that's super personal. And if you can't be vulnerable, if you can't address conflict, there's no way that you can actually figure out the root of why
and sometimes there's a scale of commitment, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that the person that is running the organization, they have to be committed, right? I mean, they're in poker, their chips are all in. And in varying levels in the organization, people can vary in their level of commitment. So you just have to understand that. So if you have someone who is, directly reports to the president or CEO, their level of commitment maybe has to be a little bit higher than someone who's way down in the chain of command. Yeah. And so that's something a leader has to balance as well.
Yeah, makes sense. Sweet. Number 4.
Avoidance of accountability. And so usually what that involves in, having been part of a lot of organizations over the years, what avoidance of accountability is that there's certain expectations, and if someone is not meeting those expectations and the leader doesn't address that, what happens is people over on this side who are doing the things that they're expected, they're looking over these other people. This is why socialism doesn't work, right? Is you can't expect me to work really hard and contribute to the betterment of the organization, and then you have people over here who aren't pulling their weight. After a while, these people are like, I can't take this anymore. Yeah. And a little bit of a rabbit trail, when I was in the Corps at A&M, I was part of the Ross Volunteer Group. And so we were, kind of a select group within the Corps, and so we had this little yellow-white cord on our uniform. But one of the things that we had to do that I think a lot of people didn't realize is we did a lot of running. And we would just go out and run, sometimes you'd run for an hour solid. And so you had to run with this rifle. Well, the rifle maybe weighed, maybe 3 to 5 pounds, which doesn't seem like a big deal. But after an hour, it's exhausting. So what happens is if you fell out of the run, your rifle stayed in the company, right? Oh. So if the guy next to you fell out, you had to carry his rifle, and they enforced it. So what would happen was, people would fall out, and you'd have to carry the rifle for a little while, and then they'd come in, and then they'd jump in. But it created this great accountability within the group that you didn't want anybody else having to carry your rifle. So here I am, 30 years later, after having been a Ross volunteer. And my mindset is always that if I'm in an organization and I'm asked to do something, I need to do that because of an accountability, because that's something I learned at A&M 30 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. Woo, man. Yeah, I think that one is, in a lot of ways, super hard for people who do lack commitment.
Right.
Because if you don't,
if you're not committed, you're not gonna. There's no reason to even have accountability.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I kind of like that all of these dysfunctions kind of fall in place one after the other. Right. It has a nice flow to it. Sweet. Last one.
Inattention to results. And this kind of goes along with accountability.
Okay.
So, what that means though is that the leader, and this is hard. I think you hit the nail on the head. Is that they progressively get harder to address. They're maybe easier to see, right? So if you ask someone, they're a painter, and they don't do a good job painting, and then you got 5 employees, and you got one guy who's just a slob, and the other 4 do a really good job, and you're paying them all the same amount, okay? Inattention to results, if you're a manager in that position, it's going to affect everybody else.
Yeah.
So one of the roles of a leader is to set reasonable expectations for everybody, to hold them accountable, and then to monitor those results. So, one of the reasons I said I love this, and this is literally my favorite business book, is that if you do the things that are in here, you'll have a successful organization, right? The people at least work well together. I mean, if you're selling typewriters, okay, you may be in trouble, okay? Yeah. And this book isn't going to address that. That's a whole that's a whole nother book.
That's
okay.
the E-Myth.
Yeah. Exactly.
E-Myth revisited.
Yeah, we have other books that you can read related to that. But if you got an organization and you want people to work well together, as a leader, this just sets a very good framework. And it really, it's personally impacted me. And I can't say, I do these things all the time, but I aspire to have an organization that minimizes dysfunctionality.
Yeah. Yeah, well, because this whole idea of dysfunction, it's really just another version of inefficiency.
Exactly.
Because when you have a dysfunction, it's something that hinders you from, and you said this at the beginning, but it's dysfunctions hinder businesses from being functional and really being successful in that. So with that being said, and I know you kind of talked about you don't always practice these, but within running a company specifically that is filled with all different types of people, first of all, what have you recognized these dysfunctions within your own team at different times, and how do you address that?
Yep. So I think, going back to the trust part, if I had a glass of water here, I tend to give people a full glass of water. That's just how I am. And I heard somebody say one time, there's a reason that I trust people is because they can trust me. And that says a lot, right? So I think I do that, maybe to a fault to some degree. But one of the things that's challenging is holding people accountable at times. It's hard because you want, you tell people, hey, this is what I expect you to do, because it involves some conflict. And, I kind of probably in my younger days, I really like conflict. But as I've gotten older and I really care about how people feel, I don't enjoy the conflict as much, because I know on the other side of the conversation, there's someone that's going to feel less than they did when we started the conversation. Now a great leader can confront you, and then when it's over with, you feel better about yourself because they built you up. So I think that's a discipline. Maybe it's even an art. But I do feel like that if you have inattention to results and avoidance of accountability, it really can be very harmful. So I don't struggle with really maybe the first three, but 4 and 5, accountability and attention to results, those are just challenging because those get to the core of a person, and if you go in and say, look, you're not doing a good job, you're behind on this, or you're not doing good quality work. I mean, those are very personal things.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's kind of where I struggle. But I think the first 3 I feel very comfortable with.
Oh, good. Yeah, well, you've had lots of practice. So.
Yeah, I've made lots of mistakes.
Yes. So as far as any other application and specific takeaways from this book, is there anything else in that regard you want to share?
Yeah, there's a couple things. One is. I guess Patrick there's some other things. Yeah, so there's a field guide. So if you're a leader and you're thinking about taking your team through this, which I really recommend. I'll give a little plug for having a annual retreat. And if your company's got enough money, the better thing is just to get away and go out of town, get away from the office. If you can't do that, go to a hotel, or if somebody's got a nice house or something, go over to their place and just get away from the office for a while. Hopefully your leadership team isn't more than about 10 people. I mean, if you got 20 people, it's going to be hard to do that. But if you got, 8 to 10, get away, have everybody read this book, give them a month to do it, and give them an Audible account if they don't like to read. And as a leader, read this field guide. And then the other thing, which I think is really neat, is they've got this test that you can take. So it's called
tests.
Yeah, it's a team assessment. And so you kind of go through and have everybody take it. Matter of fact, here's the scores that I did when we did this thing, and we kind of rated how we were doing as a team. So I think those are very practical things. In the book, so you don't have to necessarily buy these things, but the book, toward the end, he's got some really practical things about building your team. Matter of fact, the team assessment questionnaire is on pages 191 and 194. So anyway, I think if you're looking to bring a group of people together, and even elders, like Steve Burrell had Joel Anderson and I read this book.
Those are members.
Those are elders with me.
People in our church.
Yeah, at Magnolia Bible Church. He had us read this because even as an elder group, any organization where you got high capacity leaders working together, you need to be cognizant of these dysfunctions.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts you want to share?
I think the last thing I wrote here is I cannot think of a better book for a team to read as part of an offsite retreat. The vast majority of organizations are dysfunctional in some regards, including families. Let this book help you not be.
Ooh.
So it's like a lot of things. If you're aware of the problems, and then you can address them.
Yeah.
But if you don't even know that they exist in your organization, you're just like, what's the old saying? If you're shooting in the dark, what's the point of aiming?
Yeah.
And so this provides a framework for you to say, these are some things that we need to work on. So, and usually the person who is the biggest problem in your organization, they're not even aware that they do it. But by them reading a book, you hope that there creates this awareness like, hey, maybe I'm part of the problem here.
Yeah, exactly. And if they don't recognize it, they're definitely the problem.
Yeah.
Love it. Sweet. Awesome. Well, thank you guys for listening to this episode. We really appreciate it. Next time, we're going to be talking about one that you have given to many people.
Yep.
Yeah. So this is also one of your probably top favorites. I mean, these are all your favorites. Let's be real.
Yeah, that's a problem if I say, hey, this is my favorite. I don't think I've said that yet, but
yeah,
anyway,
this
I won't say that again.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, because every time it's just going to be.
If every book's your favorite book, none of them
are, exactly. So, but if you guys want to reach out to us, feel free to do that. We are on Instagram at Business by the Books. You can also email us if you read one of these books. Let us know your thoughts, experiences, and how it's changing your perspective in business. And that is businessbythebooks@gmail.com. And you can also visit our website, businessbythebooks.com. So everything's just Business by the Books, and you'll find us. We try to keep it simple. So yes, just find us at anywhere at Business by the Books. So yes, awesome. Close us out, Daddy.
I will. Leaders are readers, and if you're not reading, you're not leading.
Awesome. Thank you guys for listening, and we will talk to you in the next episode. Bye.